Hello and welcome to the Castle Talk podcast, where we talk to writers and creators of today's genre worlds. From Denver, Colorado, I'm your host, Jason Henderson, author of the upcoming series Young Captain Nemo from Fievel and Friends Macmillan Books. Tonight, Grady Hendrix is the author of Horror Store, about a haunted Scandinavian furniture store that NPR selected as one of the best books of 2014. It's been translated into 14 languages and is being turned into a television series. His new book is a nonfiction chronicle of the boom in horror paperback publishing in the 70s and 80s that followed in the wake of Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist, and Thomas Tryon's The Other. It's called Paperbacks from Hell. That's what we're going to be talking about today. Welcome, Grady.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm so excited that you could join. I just got the book. I was looking at it. It's from Quirk Books. I'm looking at it over the weekend. There's so much really cool writing here. But first of all, I don't think I had seen a book like this before. That there was actually, one that chronicled the fact that there was a time when paperbacks ruled horror, and that kind of ruled the culture, and then that time is no more. So how did you wander into this?
Well, it's funny. I was sort of surprised that no one had written this book before. It's rare that some corner of pop culture hasn't been picked over and farmed into oblivion. But I'm a film guy first off, mostly, and in film there's this sort of tradition of going out into the wild and finding like the really obscure movies and tracking down sort of lost and forgotten filmmakers, but I didn't see that so much in books. It exists a little bit, but I would be wandering into these giant used paperback stores, and the ones with like everyone trades in their romance novels for credit, and they still have a big Western section, and I see these aisles of horror paperbacks, and I just had no idea where to start with them, or what authors to look for, what titles to look for. And so I kept looking for a resource to sort of give me some direction, and I realized eventually I kind of have to write it myself.
And you consulted a little bit with Will Erickson, right? I actually talked to
Yeah,
him a while back on this show because he runs that amazing blog.
yeah. Will was on board as sort of like my researcher, right hand guy. He has an afterword that he contributed with a lot of his recommendations that I don't talk about. And when I was putting the book together, he was really, really valuable in sort of figuring out the structure. Like, how do you write this book? Like, what do you say and how and in what order? In terms of, it could have followed the genres, it could have gone chronologically, it could have been author by author, and so we
Yeah.
spent hours on the phone figuring that out.
So I just kind of want to just go through some favorite things. So first of all, for the listener, what's really cool about this book, and it's true if you get the ebook edition as well, but it's a great big paperback, and all through as you go into these different topics, whether it's like whether you're going into stuff that's about haunted houses, what you call real estate nightmares, or creepy Catholics, or when animals attack. Each one, you've got all of these representations of these old paperbacks, and there's definitely a visual language, and you track this a little bit. There's a visual language of what horror paperbacks looked like in the 70s and 80s that's very, very distinct. And you even go into the artists who created it, but it's so strange to me that this is a visual phenomenon that was part of the culture, and it's just gone.
Yeah, well, it's funny. Everyone remembers these books from being a kid, or most people. You saw them in the drugstore racks, on the spinner racks at like bus stations or train
Yeah.
stations, even gas stations. Some of them sold these books, and they were designed to be quick and cheap reads, but the covers were sort of the number one sales tool. Like if you weren't a big name like Stephen King or V.C. Andrews, or even someone like John Saul, the big selling tool was the cover. And so the
Yeah.
covers were painted. It was kind of the last gasp of realist painting for book covers, and really the second to last gasp of sort of seeing brushstrokes on covers. I mean, as the boom was dying out in the 90s, digital was coming in, and
Yeah.
so the people who did this, it's like they would make these giant oil and acrylic paintings that,
Yeah.
the publisher would use them, and then they were sort of lost forever. There's a couple
You
very
mentioned die
few people.
cuts. Oh, I
Sure,
interrupted
there's
you. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no, no. I was just gonna say there's very few people who collect this stuff. And I talked to a lot of the artists, and a lot of them still have these paintings. They're gorgeous. But this stuff was designed to be transitory.
You mentioned a lot of like so first of all, I had been fascinated before this. I'd kind of gotten into the paperback horror thing after just going to a lot of used bookstores, but I was always really fascinated by the movement that came right before the big mass market horror paperback movement, which was the women running from houses movement. You know,
Oh, sure.
the Gothic romance period, and
Yeah.
it's amazing to me how culturally that dominated the 60s. I mean, and that was just there like crazy. And then it just goes away, but it becomes something in the horror genre.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Gothics were really, really a big deal. And I mean, like you said, they sort of dominated the 60s. And it's interesting because that's where sort of the idea that horror wasn't something that happened in the dungeon of an old castle on the outskirts of town, or it wasn't a giant monster from a radioactive, desert or something, but horror was something that was happening inside your house. That the monster was possibly someone you were married to.
Hmm.
One of the things that was really great writing this book was doing the research for it. And, everything happens for a reason. And those Gothics seem to have sort of come out of nowhere. But they really all go back to this editor named Jerry Gross at Ace. And he actually wrote a memo. I mean, he sort of discovered these lost Gothics from the 20s
Hmm.
that were popular in the UK. And he wrote a memo that, I mean, that was revitalizing the sign that actually says, the cover should feature a woman. She should be terrified.
Right.
She should be running from a house. It needs to have one lit window. All that stuff was spelled out right there. It wasn't just an accident. And I sort of feel like there's a huge boom right now in publishing with these domestic thrillers. A
Yeah.
woman gets hit on the head and she can't remember anything, and she wakes up and it's 39 years later and she has two kids and she's married to a guy, but there's something
Right.
weird about him. Or you know, a woman can't remember what happened to her the day before, and every day she wakes up as a new day, and her husband's playing mind games with her. Those are Gothics. I mean, those are straight up
Yes.
Gothics.
They
I mean,
could be
you read them
done
at the
they could
face,
be
it's
done to
really
look
intense.
like yeah, well, and I love it. In fact, it would be neat if The Girl Under the Train or whatever it's called would be published with a woman running from a house cover. Your one of your books, My Best Friend's Exorcism, I think it's called,
Yeah.
or is it My Best Friend's Exorcist? But the cover looks like a painted cover from the 1980s. It's astonishing.
Yeah, they did a great. Doogie Horner is the art director at Quirk, and he's a horror guy, and he really wanted that to look like one of those painted VHS covers. And it really shouldn't have happened. We didn't have enough time to do it, but he managed to pull it off, and it looks great. But
the
it's a lost thing. It's a lost style.
which you have a style that's lost enough, you can make it new again, essentially. The you mentioned die cut covers. You say that the die cut covers sort of you attribute it to something to differentiate VC Andrews. VC Andrews writing her creepy suburban horror stories,
Right.
and they come up with this look that was going to be the flowery die cut cover that would open up to see the heroine sort of staring into the distance, and that became that launched 1,000 die cut covers.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there had been a few die cut covers before, but really it was the art director, Milton Charles, at, I believe it was Pocket, who did the D.C. Andrews, and it was a really tough thing to lick. The editor just would not accept any of the covers they were coming up with. And
Mm.
finally he remembered that you could do the die cut. And it's technically really difficult to do. But so yeah, so that's, and those DC Andrews, because they were such hits, they really spawned a million imitators in terms of like cover design.
Well, imitation, in fact, one theme that you go through, and again, you're going through these different topics, but imitation becomes kind of a key in a time when, for some reason, paperbacks are not are the thing that you kick back with in the evening, instead of cable TV, necessarily. It's 11 o'clock at night before you go to bed. You're going to kick back with a paperback, and so imitation becomes super important. You mentioned that there's like a million things that are quote unquote better than The Exorcist or as creepy as Rosemary's Baby or whatever. That
Right.
language drives all these.
Yeah, I mean, people really had to struggle to sell these books like anything. And so the covers were one way to sell them, and then having a blurb that referred to something people knew, like The Exorcist or Rosemary's Baby or Thomas Tryon's The Other, or getting a blurb in the 80s. That was the 70s. Getting a blurb in the 80s from Stephen King was huge.
Hmm.
Um, and some of these authors, it's kind of amazing, have these giant careers that have just sort of disappeared. I mean, Peter Straub still writes, but there were
Yes.
times when he was selling millions of copies of paperbacks. John Saul was another one. Just this whole Dean Koontz isn't even as big as he used to be. These guys were real giants, and book publishing was different. A sort of mid-list book could sell 80,000 to 120,000 copies, no sweat. And today, really 30,000 to 50,000 is like a blockbuster hit. So
Yeah.
publishing is huge amount.
That's amazing that it's changed. By the way, you bring up Peter Straub, and he strikes me as being this very thoughtful, very sort of just. I think he has a very unusual American voice, and I really think it's fabulous. I mean, Julia, Ghost Story, all those things. He's an amazing writer, and you actually read a lot of these, and you even have a lot of fun with some writers who are clearly very pulpy. They're just going very, very fast through an absurd story, deliberately making it super strange. And then you have people like Straub, who is a very sort of who is I guess you'd say consciously, but who is an artist.
Mhm.
But all of them in the end might have very garish covers. Go ahead.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's everyone got sold sort of the same way. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
It didn't really matter if you were Deborah Sherwood writing Blood Sisters, which is a really terrible book with a beautiful cover by William Thiessen
yeah,
of a skeleton in a graduation gown. You were getting sold the same way as Peter Straub. Your book was
yeah,
the same size. You had the same cover real estate to play with. There wasn't a lot of differentiation. But there were lots of people. Peter Straub, I mean, Joan Sampson, Elizabeth Engstrom, just really amazing, really talented authors. Ken Greenhall, but who had a very literary style, but they were being sold right next to people who were writing pulp, to all
sure.
intents and purposes. And so it's hard to
And
tell what's good and what's not.
well, and pulp has kind of its place. You have this wonderful quote where you say, "If you read 5 horror novels from the '80s, then you read 4 prologues set during World War II." I love that.
Right. Well, there were these tropes that were very much a part of the business, and prologues were one of them. I mean, and you kind of get now why editors are very prologue adverse. Every single one of these books would have a prologue set in the past, or set in some other country, or something to make things feel more. I don't know, more literary, I guess. Prologue sounds like a fancy word. I mean, it became as
Interesting.
much of a cliche as the cold open on a TV show is these days.
Yeah, yeah. You talked about Joy Fielding did a Manson exploitation book, and that she's disowned
Yeah,
it. And I thought, why? When you think about it, so you wrote a trashy novel, okay? You wrote a novel that was part of a culture, and it was intended to be trashy and exploit people's fears, which is what horror is supposed to do. In other words, it seems strange to me that you would look at your early books and go, "Oh well, I'm too good for that now," even if you did it well.
yeah, yeah. Well, it's interesting. The transformations actually, it gets a little silly at times, but it's a really well written book. But I think the reason she disowned it is taste.
Hmm.
It is written and published only a couple of years after the Manson murders, and actually, I believe it was published while Charles Manson's trial was still going on, or shortly thereafter. And it feels a little like Valley of the Dolls or something. It's a soap opera about
Sure.
actresses trying to make it in L.A. And really, suddenly, like at the end, you have a real Tate LaBianca style home invasion where more than half the cast gets murdered, and it's really shocking and really stark, and it is the Manson murders. And
Uh-huh.
I feel like one reason she might be disowning it is keeping it that close to reality and sort of exploiting, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but using the murders to sell a book. I think it may strike her as something she wouldn't do now and is maybe embarrassed that she did when she was much younger.
You know, you're um, talking about exploitation. One of the things about these books strikes me is that they'll capture what is sort of on the mind of the culture at the time. Like you talk about the creation of
Sure.
the women running from houses, and if you think about it, that's really just trying to give a visual motif to people's dissatisfaction with the way marriage was and was being presented in the 1960s. And you talk about how the haunted house story, by the way, Burn Offerings, one of my favorite books,
That's
the things
terrific.
like
Yeah.
Burn Offerings, The Shining, and I would, by the way, say Amityville Horror also fits in here, became a new way of doing haunted house stories that were all about money anxiety. The
Yeah.
middle class being afraid of losing its money, which you can't afford to buy a house and then throw it away.
Right. Yeah. And no, what you say about Gothics is there's, I mean, I think it was Joanna Russ who wrote a novel or an essay in '73 about them that said Gothics they contained all the excitement promised by marriage that seldom provided by it. Uh, and the haunted house books, I think, is one of those things where there have been haunted house books before. There was Richard Matheson's Hell House. There was Shirley Jackson's amazing Haunting of Hill House. But no one, it was always about psychic investigators going to investigate a haunted house. It wasn't about a
Yeah,
family, buying a house and having those problems where it's not just your life that's at risk, it's your future, right? Like you lose all your money on this house. I mean, that was the whole Amityville thing. We can't move
yeah,
because we tied up all our money in this house. And so it's like, wow, they move out. They must really be scared of this house if they're willing to lose their write off their mortgage and their down payment. Um,
absolutely.
Although I will put for the I think the 28 days that the Lutz family stayed in the Amityville horror house was probably the most lucrative 28 days in American real estate history. I mean, man, the Lutz
Absolutely.
family rode that right into the ground. Um,
It's so funny. I agree with you completely. It's so weird, by the way, how toxic people who know about the Lutzes, because you raise it because it's something that people raise all the time. It's like, well, I don't want to give more money to those guys, and I'm always like, oh, I prefer to think of the Amityville Horror as just a trashy fiction instead of somebody's sort of con job because it doesn't
right,
matter.
right.
I mean, like, 100 years from now, nobody's going to remember whether or not there was some con artist who was who was
Right.
terrible to his family at the center of this novel. But yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, and you this is an example. You spend time like going into the writing of some, and that's why it's impossible to hit like everything and presume that like I know Dean Anderson, who was doing splatterpunk novels back then.
Mhm.
People like that. There's all this stuff. You spend all these time going through these books, and there's still all this stuff in theory that you could get to in a whole second book.
Oh, sure. I mean, I barely touch on the Christopher Pike and R.L. Stein stuff that was coming out in the late '80s into the early '90s. Pre Goosebumps,
Yeah.
it was when Stein was writing for teenagers.
Hmm.
Lois Duncan, the other big YA horror author. And that was sort of this progression of horror because it started out in the '70s. It was for adults. Here were parents with
Yeah.
their children who were possessed or they were pregnant or, their marriages and they're buying houses and all this stuff. In the '80s, horror got much more for kids. It was about rock and roll musicians, and you had that sort of slasher boom, which camp counselors and kids on the trip. And then in the late '80s and early '90s, it really became targeted at kids with the Christopher Pikes and the R.L. Steins, clearly writing teenage horror novels. And I
Yeah.
hardly touch on the Nazis. I mean, good God, there are Nazi vampires, there are Nazi werewolves. I had a whole chapter basically on Nazis that I had to cut for a room.
Are
And
you
there's this stuff
serious?
that,
You cut a
oh
chapter of Nazi horror? That's amazing.
yeah, I mean, there was just no room for it. It was, and a lot of it was British, weirdly enough. But apparently, England can't get enough Nazis. There was famously, I think in the '60s or '70s, there was an author who said the three things you can put on a cover that will make your book a bestseller in England is someone playing golf, a cat, or a Nazi. So yeah,
Uh,
it's a lot's gone. A lot is gone that I could have gone into, and I'm bummed.
Well, there's always room in the future. You do talk about spooky Catholics, and I'm fascinated by the fact that the culture, and by the way, when you get rid of taste, you can kind of talk about anything. Like you mentioned, this is the point where you can do Jewish horror stories about Jewish families wielding strange Yiddish power against cult-like figures and just exploit the hell out of the Holocaust. And you've got over in these other books this weird obsession with spooky Catholics, as though nobody's ever
Oh, sure.
met a Catholic before.
Right. Well, a big part of that was two things. One is that The Exorcist made sort of the Catholic priest this romantic figure, right? He was this you couldn't have sex with him, you couldn't marry him, but he was this brooding kind of why was he in the priesthood? What troubling secrets were in his past? I mean, they really became a full blown Gothic hero. And the other thing was that I think it was 78 was the election or the enthronement, I guess, of the first non-Italian Pope, John Paul II. And
Hmm.
it's hard now, if you didn't live through it, to remember what a rock star moment that was. I mean, he was the first Pope in a long, 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 long time to come to America on this sort of victory tour. He was the first Pope to go into the behind the Iron Curtain into the communist bloc countries.
Hmm.
And he went to Poland, where he was from. It was a communist country at the time, and people were specifically told, do not come out in public to see the Pope pass or any of that. That's illegal. You will be arrested. And tens of thousands of people streamed into the streets to watch the Pope go by. I mean, that's the kind of sort of they all could have gone to prison. They could have lost everything, and they didn't
Yeah.
care. He was this rock star, and so obviously there were paperback writers eager to sort of cash in on that, and editors who wanted to greenlight books to sort of cash in on this sudden Catholics are hot moment.
Yeah, and of course, since it's horror, the way horror works, and I find this fascinating, is you can take anything that is of interest, and it doesn't mean that you mean that philosophically this thing is evil. I'm sure there are people who feel that way about Catholics and people who feel that way about whatever, about dogs. But you take that thing in a horror story, your Boy Scout troop, your doctor, your psychiatrist, your Catholic priest, your whatever your sewing circle, and it becomes a dark version of that. It is secretly some sort of cabal that's trying to destroy you.
Yeah, I mean, and it was interesting that happens. This idea that we're going to take something mundane and make it monstrous. To see sort of how it
Mm.
holds up under the mutation. I mean, the splatterpunk guys loved to write books about heavy metal musicians and rock musicians.
Yeah.
Because it was also when the parental advisory lyrics thing was happening, and everyone was clutching their pearls over like heavy metal lyrics and stuff. Um, but what's interesting is those books were a pushback against that moral majority. This way of saying, "Hey, screw you guys. This is horror and this is rock and roll." But in doing so, they fulfilled all the fantasies of the moral majority. I
Of
mean,
course.
they wrote books about heavy metal musicians and bands who worship Satan, who are
And
avatars
Dungeons
of
and
Satan.
Dragons.
Yeah, exactly.
I
They basically said, playing this album backwards will unleash a demon. And you were kind of like, I don't think this is quite doing what you guys think it's doing. On the other hand, you had that fail completely. Like, there is literally not a single killer dog book that is not tragically sad, because at the end of the day, everyone likes dogs. So if
Yeah.
dogs have gone rabid and are attacking and killing people, you sort of sit there going, well, what did the people do to the dog? Oh no, like we had the government experimented on them. The dogs are like military dogs, and that's sad. Well, the dogs have rabies. That's sad because we like dogs. And it's so
Yeah.
when a dog becomes a monster, we sort of like, whose fault is this?
I love how many horror paperbacks from the 70s and 80s feature creepy little children staring at you like near closet doors
Yeah, sure.
and stuff like that. It's just
Yeah.
over and over and over again.
Well, all those three books that really kicked off the whole horror boom was Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist, and Thomas Tryon's Other. And all three of those are about evil kids. I mean, Rosemary's Baby, granted, you don't see the baby until the very end. But they're all about kids. And, and then The Omen came out, I think, in 76, and the novelization sold
Mm,
millions of copies. I mean, you go to a paperback shop now and you'll find at least a dozen copies of The Omen and its sequels. Even though there are only 3 Omen movies, there's 5 Omen novels. It was so popular. And so, yeah, I mean, the killer kid thing was huge in the 70s and up until the 80s, and it mutates into all different forms. I mean, you have everything from medical thrillers that were about, the fears of women, giving birth to monsters, and, my
right.
baby's a mutant. And then there was like killer baby books, where literally the killers are like 6 months infants. And then you have killer kid books where the kids are like 7 years old. And then you have killer teenager books, and they range in quality from really pulpy garbage all the way to something like Let's Go Play at the Adams, which is a really dark, heavy, brilliant book. It's you could write a whole book on killer kid books.
So there's I just have to say as we wrap up, there is a lot of really funny writing in here as you go through. Sometimes you'll just sort of zoom past a whole bunch of stuff because you want to cover a whole genre, and sometimes you'll dig into a particular title, and it's always very well observed. I thought the writing is very funny, and it's one of the best parts
Okay.
of this book. Sure. So the book is Paperbacks from Hell. It's brand new from Quirk Books. It looks beautiful. I mean, this is really literally this isn't a coffee table book. It's sort of a large trade paperback, and you should put out a coffee table book version. Frankly, I mean, because this just it's so cool to look at.
Oh, thanks. Well, it's interesting. I got to know a lot of the artists, the cover artists doing this, and a couple of them are getting together and trying to figure out a way to do an art book, but of their work, of their horror work. But the problem is
Mm,
there's just no publisher who wants to take the chance.
interesting.
Yeah, this was a book that we weren't sure there was a market for, and have been really gratified to see there is one. But Quark really sort of jumped off the cliff with this one. He sort of hoped there would be a soft landing.
That's fantastic. Really fantastic. Well, Grady Hendrix, I'm so pleased that we got a chance to talk. I have a feeling we could probably slow this down and talk for another hour, honestly, about some of this stuff. So maybe we'll do it on a panel someday. But this is really, really cool. Paperbacks from Hell is out. You can get it. Well, you can order it wherever you order books, and it's also an ebook, and the ebook looks beautiful. So I wish you all the best with it, and I'm really glad that you took time to talk this morning.
Oh yeah, no, thanks for having me. I can go on and on and on about this stuff. To me, this is barely a snack.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you. Have a fantastic day, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks a lot.